Madam President,
Senator from Arizona.
I ask unanimous consent to address the Senate as if in morning business and take as much time as I may consume.
Without objection.
70 years ago, a group of American leaders forged the rules-based international order out of the ashes of World War II. Those that were there recalled that they were, quote, present at the creation. We may well look back at 2015 and realize we were present at the unraveling. We were present at the unraveling. At the beginning of this year, President Obama was still committed to degrading and ultimately destroying ISIL. He had warned, quote, if left unchecked, ISIL could pose a growing threat beyond the Middle East, including to the United States. And in 2015, that's exactly what happened in Paris and San Bernardino, and it will not be the last. I promise my colleagues under this administration that will, with the present policy and lack of strategy, there will be other attacks on the United States of America, and I regret deeply, deeply regret having to say that, but I owe my constituents and Americans that I know and respect to tell them the truth. More than 1 year into the campaign against ISIL, it is impossible to assert that ISIL is losing and that we are winning. And if you're not winning in this kind of warfare, you are losing. Stalemate is not success. We asked the witnesses before the Senate Armed Services Committee, is ISIS contained? It is not. ISIS is not contained, contrary to the statements, bizarrely, made by the President of the United States literally hours before the attack on San Bernardino. This year, our Senate Armed Services Committee held several hearings specifically focused on the threat of ISIL, including 3 with Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. We heard about 9 lines of effort. We heard about 3 R's. We never heard a plausible theory of success nor a strategy to achieve success. What do I mean by that? There is no time that Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, will be taken. There is no strategy to take Raqqa. Raqqa, the base of the caliphate, the place where the attacks are being planned and orchestrated, the place where we have news reports that they are developing chemical weapons in Raqqa. This is the first time a terrorist organization has had a base, a caliphate, from which to operate out on. And what has happened? They are expanding globally. And by the way, they've lost some territory on the margin. Hopefully one of these days, Ramadi will fall to our forces, even though there's only been a few hundred ISIL there for the last few weeks. But the fact is that ISIL has expanded its control in Syria. It continues to dominate Sunni Arab areas in both Iraq and Syria. It maintains control of key cities like Mosul, Fallujah, and Ramadi, and efforts to retake these territories have stalled to at least some degree. Meanwhile, ISIL is expanding globally. On Tuesday, General John Campbell, commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, told the Associated Press that ISIL is seeking to establish a regional base in eastern Afghanistan as it attracts more followers and foreign fighters. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent. The AP interview, U.S. General says ISIS loyalists growing.
Without
including the record. Supporters of the Islamic State group in Afghanistan are attempting to establish a regional base in the eastern city of Jalalabad. The commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan, General John Campbell, said. In Libya, the Wall Street Journal reports that ISIL has expanded in Libya and established a new base close to Europe where it can generate oil revenues and plot terror attacks. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent. The Wall Street Journal, Islamic State tightens grip on Libyan stronghold of Sirte, the hometown, by the way, of Muammar Gaddafi. Even as foreign powers step up pressures against Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, the militant group has expanded in Libya, established a new base close to Europe where it can generate oil revenue and plot terror attacks. Libya is an oil-rich country. a very oil-rich country. You let ISIS get control of Libya, my friends, and they will have unlimited sources of revenue. It says that according to the Wall Street Journal, his presence there has grown over the past year from 200 eager fighters to approximately 5,000 strong contingent, which includes administrators and financiers, according to estimates by Libyan intelligence officials, residents, and activists in the area. And by the way, I want to, during these debates, I'll comment a little bit on it. Those who are against any intervention cite Libya as the case for not going in. Facts are a stubborn thing. Facts are, but Muammar Gaddafi was at the gates of Benghazi. He was going to slaughter thousands of people. We brought about his downfall and walked away. If we'd have walked away from Japan and Germany after World War II, it would have collapsed. If we'd have walked away from Korea, where we still have 38,000 troops, it would have collapsed. If we'd have walked away from Bosnia, it would have collapsed. I'm telling you, my colleagues, we walked away. This president and this administration did not do the things necessary after the fall of Gaddafi to build a democracy, and the people of Libya wanted it, and I can tell you that for sure because I was there. One of the great tragedies of the 21st century is our failure to act in a way to help the Libyan people transition from all those years of a brutal leader, by the way, who also was responsible for the deaths of Americans in a bar in Berlin, responsible for the shoot down of an airliner, and yet we should have left him in power. Sure, we should have. So ISIL is operating in Lebanon, Yemen, and Egypt, and other radical Islamic groups like Boko Haram in Nigeria and al-Shabaab in Somalia have pledged allegiance to ISIL. This appearance of success only enhances ISIL's ability to radicalize, recruit, and grow. There have been some progress. I recently saw on a visit to Iraq. The recent operation to retake Sinjar was important. Iraqi forces, as I mentioned, have closed in on Ramadi for weeks. They haven't finished the job, and our counterterrorism operations are taking a lot of ISIL fighters off the battlefield in Iraq and Syria. All of this represents tactical progress, and it's a testament to our civilian and military leaders who are outstanding, as well as thousands of U.S. troops helping to take the fight to ISIL every day. And I would like to point out that significant challenges remain. As a direct result of President Obama's decision to withdraw all U.S. forces from Iraq and squander hard-won American influence, the Iraqi government is weak and beholden to Iran. I tell my colleagues, have no doubt what the dominant influence in Iraq is today, and it is the Iranians. There was no more vivid example of this than when it was reported that Iraqi Prime Minister al-Abadi turned down Secretary of Defense Ash Carter's offer of new military assistance, including the use of Apache helicopters and special operation forces to help recapture Ramadi. I met with Prime Minister Abadi in Iraq. He's a good man. He knows that he needs this help, but because of the dominating influence of Iran and Shia militias in Iraq, he turned it down anyway. General McFarlane, one of the greatest generals that I have met, he's up there in the category of David Petraeus. He's leading the fight against ISIL, and he reacted by saying, very interesting comment. He said, this is a very complex environment. It is kind of hard to inflict support on somebody. It's kind of hard to inflict support on somebody. What General McFarlane is saying is that because of the Iranian dominant influence, because of that, the Iraqis, Abadi, are reluctant to accept the help they need to retake the second largest city in Iraq. The second largest city, Mosul, in Iraq, is under ISIS control, and he knows full well that Apache helicopters and special operations forces could help him do that. But who's telling him not to? The Iranians. When I was there and met with we met with the Prime Minister of Iraq, Mr. Abadi, he said to us, he said, if you Americans come, and you lose one pilot and one plane, you will leave. Now, that was the Prime Minister of Iraq's opinion. And one of the reasons, along with the Iranian influence, is because there is no trust of the United States or confidence of the United States in Iraq or in the region. It comes as no surprise that the training of Iraqi security forces has been slow. The building of support for the Sunni tribal forces even slower. ISIL captured Mosul in June of 2014. At the end of 2015, ISIL still controls the second largest city in Iraq. What do you think the families of those brave Americans who were sacrificed, those individuals still are over at Walter Reed? After the sacrifices they made and the victory that they won, now, of course, we see all of that gone a glimmering thanks to the President of the United States withdrawing all of our troops in the mistaken belief that if you pull out of wars, that wars end. They don't end. They don't end. It's hard to talk to the Gold Star mothers. Meanwhile, the Financial Times reports that ISIL is still making $1.5 million a day in oil sales. Worse, Reuters report that ISIL has made more than $500 million trading oil with significant volumes sold to, guess who? Guess who ISIL is selling oil to? The government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. So, it's hard to make some of this stuff up, and it gets a little complicated. So we are now making nice, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later, to Bashar al-Assad and their stewards, the Russians and the Iranians. Meanwhile, al-Assad is buying oil from most of it, at least $1.5 million a day from ISIL. Even as an Oval Office speech and a Pentagon photo op failed to reassure the American people, this administration has doubled down on its indecisive approach to ISIL, using limited means and indirect ways to achieve aspirational ends on a non-existent timeline. The administration now admits we're at war with ISIL. Oh, wonderful. But proceeds at every turn to minimize any American role in fighting and winning that war. America has never waged anything we've called a war and then so profoundly limited our role in the hope that some other force will emerge to win it for us. The administration says we cannot, quote, Americanize the conflict. And I also, by the way, want to point out the president has this unique and really dishonest approach to those of us who have for a long time said that we have to have more involvement and predicted what would happen. Unfortunately, we've been wrong by saying, yes, the pop-offs, as he called us in a speech from the Philippines, the pop-offs want to send hundreds of thousands of troops. You know, that is a total falsehood. And I will repeat again what we've been asking for years, and that is another 5,000 or so Americans on the ground in Iraq, and a multinational force led by the Sunni Arab countries with European participation. I would hope that people like the French would join in. About 10,000 of a 100,000 person force to go to Raqqa and take them out. As long as Raqqa exists, they will be able to export this evil throughout the world, including to the United States of America. There is no plan by this administration to retake Raqqa. There is no strategy, and that is indeed shameful. The war against ISIL was Americanized when ISIL-inspired terrorists murdered 14 Americans on our own soil in San Bernardino. This attack should be a wake-up call. We need a strategy, as I mentioned. In Syria, there's no plausible strategy to achieve this goal on anywhere near an acceptable timeline. We were briefed that it could be a year before they retake Mosul. There's no time limit on when they could even approach regaining Raqqa. The Syrian Kurds, there's no ground force that is both willing and able to retake Raqqa, nor is there a realistic prospect of one emerging anytime soon. The Syrian Kurds could take Raqqa but won't, and the Syrian Sunni Arabs want to but can't, partly due to our failure to support them. Meanwhile, the administration has continued its inaction and indifference that has allowed Bashar Assad to slaughter 250,000 people. Have no doubt who's responsible for these millions of refugees. His name is Bashar Assad, the godfather of ISIS. He's the one that's barrel-bombed thousands and thousands of his people. Bashar Assad's the one that used poison gas and crossed the red line, we might recall. It's Bashar Assad that continues this brutality, this butchery of his own people. And I'll get to what Secretary Kerry has had to say in a minute. The administration continues its policy of inaction and indifference. It has allowed Vladimir Putin to intervene militarily and protect his murderous regime. My friends, the last time that the Russians had influence in the region was when Anwar Sadat threw them out in 1973. Now they're back. Now they are major players in the Middle East. This is a headline from the Associated Press yesterday. Russian airstrikes restore Syrian military balance of power. The airstrikes of the Russians have taken out significant capabilities of the moderate resistance, not ISIS, but the moderates that we had trained and equipped, and we refused to protect. Weeks of Russian airstrikes in Syria, I quote from the Associated Press story, Russian airstrikes to restore Syrian military balance of power. Weeks of Russian airstrikes in Syria appear to have restored enough momentum to the government side to convince President Bashar Assad's foes and the world community that even if he doesn't win the war, he cannot quickly be removed by force. That realization, combined with the growing sense that the world's #1 priority is the destruction of the Islamic State group, has led many to acknowledge that however unpalatable his conduct of the war, Assad will have to be tolerated for at least some time further. Let's get this straight. Assad will be tolerated to continue to barrel bomb and slaughter innocent people. However unpalatable his conduct of the war, this kind of Orwellian understatement not only obscures the truth, but cripples the conscience. My friends, it cripples the conscience. Bashar Assad's conduct of the war, barrel bombs, chemical weapons, slaughtering women and children, not only killed 250,000 people, it's what gave rise to ISIL to start with, and it's what fuels them still. Secretary Kerry seems not to understand that fact. While in Moscow searching for, quote, common ground with Russia on Syria and Ukraine, Secretary Kerry said, and I'm not making this up now, I'm telling my colleagues, I am not making this up, quote, Russia has been a significant contributor to the progress, unquote, the world has made on Syria. Was Russia making progress when it bombed U.S.-backed Syrian forces fighting the Assad regime? Or was that when it took a brief pause from bombing Syrian moderates to indiscriminately drop dumb bombs in ISIL's territory in eastern Syria, killing untold numbers of civilians? Is that the Russian significant contributions? Secretary Kerry then said, quote, the United States and our partners are not seeking so-called regime change. The focus now is, quote, not on our differences about what can or cannot be done, immediately about Assad. i.e., dear Mr. Assad, here's a blank check. Here's your card. Do whatever you want to. Do whatever you want to. Continue your barrel bombing. Continue your torture. Continue the war crimes that you have committed. You've only killed 250,000 of your own people and drive some more into exile and murder more. At the beginning of this year, this administration still believed that Assad must go, but now, as one official said, and I quote, the meaning of Assad has to go has evolved. I repeat, administration official said, the meaning of Assad has to go has evolved. This kind of Orwellian doublespeak has become all too common in this administration, and exactly why our allies and partners around the world are losing confidence in American leadership And a very similar event happened day before yesterday, my friends, that will really be the best indicator of what I'm saying. 34 Muslim nations formed an alliance to fight terrorism, i.e. ISIL, and the United States of America didn't even know about it. They didn't even tell the United States of America that they were forming their own organization with their own strategy, their own tactics to fight against ISIS. My friends, that is an incredible statement about the total loss of American influence, prestige in the region. I have had more than one leader in the Middle East tell me, and I quote, "Sometimes we think that it's better to be America's enemy than its friend," unquote. So why is the meaning of Assad has to go evolved? Because this administration was overpowered, outplayed, and outmatched. This administration consoled themselves with the mantra of, quote, "there is no military solution," rather than facing the reality that there is a clear military dimension to a political solution in Syria. That's what Russia and Iran have demonstrated. They have changed the military facts on the ground and created the terms for a political settlement much more favorable to their interests. And I believe as a result, the conflict will grind on, ISIS will go stronger, and the refugees will keep coming. Despite, unfortunately, America's troubles in 2015 were not contained in Iraq and Syria. Despite conditions on the ground, President Obama elected to withdraw roughly half of U.S. forces from Afghanistan by the end of next year. Did you know the President of the United States, even when he announces a buildup, announces a withdrawal? So he sends the message to any potential enemy or any enemy that we're with, is we're going to build up now, but don't worry, we're going to pull out. We will withdraw. So what happens? Here we are. Pentagon says violence is on the rise in Afghanistan. Violence in Afghanistan is on the rise, according to a new Pentagon report to Congress. It says the Taliban was emboldened by the reduced U.S. military role and can be expected to build momentum from their 2015 attack strategy. It is inevitable, I say to my colleagues, there will be greater violence in Afghanistan, there will be an increase in Taliban activity, and I'm sorry to say that ISIS, who is already establishing a foothold there, will increase their presence. Meanwhile, the Iranians, in their attempts at hegemony, will provide weapons to the Taliban. So at the beginning of the year, I will save the rest of my comments about what's going on with the Iran nuclear deal, about what the Iranians have already violated. At the beginning of the year, the United States what continues occupation of Ukraine. Our much respected leader in Europe, General Breedlove, has said that he expects increased military activities by Vladimir Putin in eastern Ukraine. He still has the ambition of establishing a land bridge all the way across eastern Ukraine to Crimea so that he doesn't have to continue to supply by air and sea. And we seem to have forgotten over 8,000 people have died since Russia's invasions, including 298 innocent people aboard Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, murdered by Vladimir Putin's loyal supporters with weapons that were sent to Ukraine by Putin, not to mention the murder of Boris Nemtsov, one of the great leaders of the opposition in the shadow of the Kremlin. And the destabilization continues, even as countries as far away as Sweden. I won't go into that because the Defense Authorization Bill calls for the provision of defensive weapons to Ukraine. One of the more shameful chapters, although they've written many shameful chapters, but one of them that's really shameful is our failure to provide defensive weapons to Ukraine. There are Russian tanks, Russian-supplied tanks in eastern Ukraine. All of us have seen the pictures of them. They've slaughtered many Ukrainians, and we refuse to give the Javelin, the most effective anti-tank weapon that we could possibly have, to Ukrainians. I mean, it's beyond shameful. So I won't talk about China, which has reclaimed 400 acres earlier and now has reclaimed more than 3,000 acres in the South China Sea, and our one foray within the 12-mile limit, the Secretary of Defense failed to acknowledge before the Senate Armed Services Committee. So, my colleagues, we depart on this holiday season, hopefully sooner rather than later, with a world in turmoil, with a world that, because of a failure of American leadership, now poses direct threats, as we've just found in San Bernardino, to the United States of America. We saw too many dark days in 2015. It didn't have to be this way, and it's still within our power to choose better courses. We must never be disheartened or resigned to a world where suffering and evil are always on the ascent. On the contrary, it's in our character as Americans to face adversity with hope and optimism. We must see plainly and fully the threats to our values in order to defeat them. And as Churchill said, we recover our moral health and martial vigor and rise again to take our stand for freedom. I have no doubt America can succeed and will succeed. Madam President, I yield the floor. And I ask these articles be included in the record.
Without objection. The senator from Vermont.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.